Force entry!
I'm calling the police!
Do it! Open the door right now!
Hands up! Hands where I can see them! Don't move!
Please, what's
Get
happening?
your hands up! Keep them up!
Okay.
Stay right there! Do not move!
The story begins on a quiet Tuesday evening in a residential neighborhood known for its safety and community spirit. Inside apartment 4D, Dorothy, a 78-year-old retired librarian, was winding down her day. She had lived in this specific unit for over 20 years, creating a sanctuary filled with books, houseplants, and memories of her late husband, who had passed away 3 years prior. At 9:30 in the evening, Dorothy followed her usual routine. She took her evening medications, brushed her teeth, and settled into bed with a mystery novel. By 10 o'clock, the lights were out, and the apartment was completely silent. Dorothy was fast asleep, unaware that her life was about to be upended by a series of errors that would shock the nation. Outside, the atmosphere was different. Officer Daniel Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the police force, had been patrolling the area for 2 hours. At approximately 10:15, he received a dispatch regarding a noise complaint. The report stated that loud music was coming from apartment 4B. However, upon arriving at the complex, Officer Rodriguez did not go to apartment 4B. Instead, he walked up the stairs and stopped in front of apartment 4D, Dorothy's home. The unit was dark and silent. There was no music, no television noise, and no sign of a disturbance. Despite the obvious lack of noise, Rodriguez prepared to make contact. Mounted next to the door was a small, unassuming device that would become the most critical witness in this case, a doorbell camera that Dorothy had installed 6 months earlier for package security. The camera began recording exactly 43 seconds before Rodriguez started pounding on the door. The footage shows him standing there, listening to the silence, before he begins to knock. The initial knocks were firm, but quickly escalated into aggressive pounding that shook the doorframe. Inside, Dorothy woke up in a state of confusion and terror. The time was now past 10:30 at night. The camera captured the escalation perfectly. Rodriguez did not announce himself as a police officer immediately. He simply shouted for the door to be opened. His voice was angry, demanding, and impatient. Dorothy, frightened and wearing her nightgown, approached the door but was too scared to open it. She called out, asking who was there and pleading for the person to leave. Rodriguez responded with threats, telling her to open the door immediately, or he would force his way inside. He never mentioned a noise complaint. He never mentioned he was looking for apartment 4B. He simply demanded submission. Terrified, Dorothy yelled through the wood that she was calling the police, not realizing the police were already the ones threatening her safety. This interaction set the stage for a violation of civil rights that would eventually cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars. The situation outside apartment 4D had reached a breaking point. Officer Rodriguez had been pounding on the door for several minutes, his patience entirely exhausted. Inside, Dorothy was retreating from the door, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. She had no way of knowing that the man threatening to break down her door was a law enforcement officer, as he had failed to properly identify himself or explain his presence. He had simply acted with aggression. The doorbell camera continued to record as Rodriguez made a fateful decision. Without a warrant, without consent, and without any exigent circumstances indicating an emergency inside, he decided to force entry. The camera captured Rodriguez stepping back to gain momentum before throwing his shoulder against the door. The wood splintered, and the lock gave way with a loud crash. The door swung open violently, revealing the dimly lit living room of the elderly widow. Rodriguez stormed inside, his hand near his holster, ready to confront a suspect. Instead, he found a 78-year-old woman in a robe, backing away in terror, clutching her phone to her ear. The silence of the apartment stood in stark contrast to the violence of his entry. There was no party, no loud music, and no threat. At this moment, any reasonable officer would have realized a mistake had been made. The apartment layout and the resident did not match the profile of a rowdy noise disturbance. However, rather than de-escalating the situation or apologizing, Rodriguez doubled down on his aggression. He began shouting questions at Dorothy, asking if anyone else was in the home, and demanding to know why she had not opened the door sooner. He treated her not as a victim of his error, but as a suspect who had defied his authority. Dorothy, still on the line with the emergency operator, was too in shock to answer coherently. She simply wept and asked why he was there. The doorbell camera, which was now recording the interior view through the open doorway, captured the arrival of a second officer, Supervisor Sarah Kim. Officer Kim arrived on the scene moments after the breach. The footage shows her walking up the stairs, seeing the broken door, and entering the apartment. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She looked from the shattered doorframe to the terrified elderly woman, and then to Rodriguez. She realized almost instantly that they were in the wrong apartment. She asked Rodriguez what was going on, and when he tried to mention the noise complaint, she pointed out the obvious silence. Officer Kim immediately began damage control, ordering Rodriguez to stand down and approaching Dorothy with a calm, apologetic demeanor. She recognized that a massive procedural failure had just occurred, one that had traumatized an innocent citizen in her own sanctuary. While the video footage provided a visual record of the incident, the audio recording from the 911 call provided a heartbreaking soundtrack to Dorothy's terror. This episode focuses on that specific piece of evidence, which played a crucial role in the investigation. When Dorothy first dialed 911, the time was 10:32 at night. The recording begins with her frantic voice, telling the operator that a man was trying to break into her house. In the background of the call, the heavy rhythmic pounding on the door is clearly audible. It sounded like thunder, relentless and threatening. The operator on the other end of the line tried to keep Dorothy calm. She asked for Dorothy's address and whether she could see the person. Dorothy explained that she was too scared to look through the peephole because the door was shaking so violently. She told the operator, quote, 0. This statement proved that Dorothy genuinely believed her life was in danger. She did not know it was the police. She thought she was about to be robbed or attacked. The fear in her voice was palpable and undeniable. Then, the recording captures the moment of the breach. There is a massive crashing sound, followed by Dorothy screaming. It is a sound of pure terror. The phone clattered, but remained connected. The operator can be heard shouting, quote, 1, over the line. Rodriguez's voice becomes audible, shouting commands. This was a critical piece of evidence because it proved that Rodriguez entered the home while Dorothy was actively seeking help from the authorities. It highlighted the irony and the tragedy of the situation, a citizen calling the police for protection from the police. The recording continues for several minutes after the entry. Listeners can hear the confusion as Rodriguez realizes there is no party. They can hear Dorothy sobbing, saying, quote, 2. The arrival of Officer Kim is also captured on the audio. Her voice provides a sharp contrast to Rodriguez. She sounds professional and concerned. She can be heard asking Rodriguez, quote, 3. A silence follows this question, which was more damning than any verbal admission of guilt. The 911 call ended only when paramedics arrived to check on Dorothy's heart rate, which had spiked to dangerous levels due to the shock. This audio recording would later be synchronized with the video footage to create an irrefutable timeline of the officer's misconduct. The aftermath of the incident moved from the privacy of Dorothy's apartment to the public square of the internet with breathtaking speed. The morning after the raid, Dorothy's daughter, Lisa, arrived. Lisa was a former military service member who lived 4 hours away. When she saw the broken doorframe and her mother's trembling hands, she was consumed by a cold fury. She knew that without hard evidence, the police department might try to minimize the incident or sweep it under the rug. She immediately accessed the cloud storage account associated with her mother's doorbell camera. Lisa watched the video file 3 times in disbelief. She saw the 43 seconds of silence before the arrival. She saw the lack of identification. She heard the threats. She saw the violent entry. Realizing this was a clear violation of rights, she contacted a lawyer. But she also made a strategic decision to release the footage to the public. She uploaded the video to social media with the caption, "This is how they treat 78-year-old widows." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Within the first 4 hours, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. By the end of the 4th day, that number had climbed to 15 million views. The footage was shared on every major social media platform. The hashtag #DorothyJustice began trending nationwide. People were outraged not just by the mistake of the wrong address, but by the aggression. Viewers commented on how Rodriguez seemed ready for a fight before he even knocked. They pointed out that a simple check of the house number would have prevented the entire ordeal. Local news stations picked up the story immediately, broadcasting the footage on the evening news. This forced the police department to respond much faster than they likely would have otherwise. Usually, internal investigations can take months, with details kept private. However, the viral nature of the video meant the department could not hide. The public demanded to know the officer's name and why he was still on the payroll. Protests were organized outside the police station. The video had transformed a local incident into a national conversation about police conduct, excessive force, and the vulnerability of the elderly. Dorothy, who had lived a quiet and private life, was suddenly the face of a movement, all because a $50 camera had captured the truth that officer reports might have omitted. With the eyes of the nation on the department, the Internal Affairs Division had no choice but to launch a rigorous and expedited investigation. Officer Rodriguez was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. The investigators began by pulling the dispatch logs and the original call for the noise complaint. What they found was troubling. The call had come in regarding apartment 4B, but the caller had been anonymous and vague. There was no corroborating evidence of a party. When investigators interviewed the residents of 4B, they were a young couple who had been watching a movie at a reasonable volume. The investigation then turned to Rodriguez's actions at the scene. Policy clearly stated that forced entry required a warrant or exigent circumstances, meaning an immediate threat to life or evidence. Rodriguez had neither. He had heard no noise. He had seen no violence. His claim that he, quote, was contradicted by the video, which showed him waiting and listening to silence for nearly a minute before acting. If he truly thought someone was in danger, he would not have waited. His behavior was classified as an illegal search and seizure, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. More damaging, however, was what the investigators found when they opened Rodriguez's personnel file. This was not his first complaint. Over his 15-year career, Rodriguez had accumulated numerous citations for aggressive behavior and rudeness. 2 years prior, a complaint had been filed by a young mother who claimed Rodriguez had tried to force his way into her home without a warrant, but she had no video evidence, so the complaint was dismissed as unfounded. Another report detailed an incident where he had detained a teenager for an hour without cause. The pattern was undeniable. Rodriguez had a history of escalating minor situations into major confrontations. The investigation revealed a systemic failure within the department to discipline him. Supervisors had ignored red flags, allowing a volatile officer to remain on the streets. Internal emails surfaced during the discovery phase, showing that 2 lieutenants had discussed Rodriguez's short fuse, but had decided to simply transfer him to a different patrol sector rather than retraining or disciplining him. This negligence meant that the department was not just liable for the mistake of one officer, but for the institutional failure that allowed him to hold a badge. The investigation concluded that Rodriguez had violated multiple core policies, falsified his initial verbal report to the supervisor, and used excessive force against a vulnerable citizen. While the legal and administrative wheels were turning, Dorothy was living a nightmare. The physical damage to her apartment was repaired within 24 hours. The property management company replaced the door frame and the lock immediately. However, the psychological damage was far more difficult to fix. Episode 6 focuses on the human cost of this police misconduct. Dorothy, a woman who had valued her independence above all else, found herself unable to return to apartment 4D. She moved into her daughter Lisa's guest bedroom, but sleep did not come easily. Dorothy began suffering from severe nightmares. In her dreams, the sound of the door splintering would wake her up in a cold sweat. She developed a condition known as hypervigilance. Every time a car door slammed outside, or a delivery person knocked on the neighbor's door, Dorothy would experience a panic attack. Her heart rate would spike, and she would find herself shaking uncontrollably. A geriatric psychologist evaluated her and diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition usually associated with soldiers or victims of violent crime, not retired librarians. The trauma also affected her physical health. The stress exacerbated her high blood pressure, requiring an increase in her medication. She lost her appetite and lost 10 pounds in the first month following the incident. But the most profound loss was her sense of sanctuary. For 20 years, her apartment had been the one place where she felt completely safe. That safety had been violated by the very people sworn to protect it. Dorothy told her therapist that she felt, quote, 9, as if the walls of her home were made of paper. This episode also explores the loss of community. Dorothy stopped baking cookies for neighbors. She stopped sitting on her balcony to read. She withdrew from her social circle, too embarrassed and traumatized to explain what had happened, even though the world already knew. She felt a misplaced sense of shame, wondering if she had done something to provoke the officer, despite all evidence to the contrary. Her daughter Lisa had to take a leave of absence from her job to care for her mother, creating a financial and emotional strain on the entire family. The camera had captured the 43 seconds of the incident, but it could not capture the months of quiet suffering that followed. This was the silent tragedy that the settlement money would eventually try and fail to fully address. 3 weeks after the video went viral, the legal system began to move against Officer Rodriguez with full force. The district attorney, facing immense public pressure and staring at irrefutable video evidence, convened a grand jury. A grand jury is a group of citizens who decide if there is enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. In this case, the decision was not difficult. The prosecution played the doorbell camera footage, the 911 call, and presented the internal affairs report. The grand jury voted to indict Daniel Rodriguez on multiple felony charges. The most serious charge was burglary of a habitation with intent to commit assault. He was also charged with official oppression and violation of civil rights. These were not minor disciplinary infractions. These were serious crimes that carried the potential for years in prison. When the indictment was announced, Rodriguez turned himself in. His mugshot was plastered across the news, a stark contrast to his official police portrait. Simultaneously, Dorothy's attorney, Rebecca Martinez, filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Rodriguez personally. The lawsuit argued that Rodriguez had violated Dorothy's Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. It also argued that the department was liable because they knew of Rodriguez's past behavior and failed to stop him. This is known as a, quote, 10 claim, which allows citizens to sue local governments for unconstitutional policies or customs. Rodriguez hired a private defense attorney, as the police union refused to provide him with legal counsel for the criminal charges, citing the egregious nature of his conduct. His defense strategy was weak. He attempted to argue, quote, 11, a legal doctrine that protects officers from lawsuits unless they violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. However, the judge quickly rejected this motion. The judge stated that any reasonable officer would have known that breaking into a silent home without a warrant or emergency was a violation of the Constitution. The legal walls were closing in on Rodriguez. He was facing a criminal trial where he could lose his freedom, and a civil trial where he could lose all his assets. The video had stripped him of every defense usually available to law enforcement officers. As the criminal case prepared for trial, the civil lawsuit moved toward a resolution. The city's legal team and their insurance carriers analyzed the case and came to a grim conclusion. They could not win. If this case went before a jury, the combination of the sympathetic victim, a 78-year-old widow, and the aggressive video-recorded defendant would lead to a verdict that could be in the millions. The video was too clear, and the negligence was too obvious. To minimize the financial damage and the ongoing negative publicity, the city decided to settle. Negotiations began in earnest. Dorothy's attorney, Rebecca Martinez, came to the table with a list of damages: medical bills for Dorothy's heart condition, therapy costs for her PTSD, the cost of relocating to a new home, and punitive damages for the violation of her rights. The city initially offered $200,000, a standard figure for police misconduct cases involving no physical battery. Martinez rejected it immediately, threatening to take the case to trial and put the police chief on the stand to answer for the department's lack of oversight. The city capitulated. They agreed to a settlement of $865,000. This was one of the largest settlements in the city's history for a case involving property damage and emotional distress without severe physical injury. The figure was meant to send a message. It was an acknowledgement that the system had failed Dorothy completely. For Dorothy, the money was never the primary motivation, but it provided a necessary safety net. It allowed her to purchase a small house in a gated community, closer to her daughter, ensuring she would never have to live in an apartment complex again. It covered her medical bills and ensured her financial security for the rest of her life. However, when the settlement was announced, Dorothy issued a statement through her lawyer. She said, "No amount of money can restore the sense of safety I lost that night. I am accepting this so I can move on, but I hope the city pays closer attention to who they give badges to." The settlement was a victory for justice, but it was paid for by the taxpayers, a fact that further angered the community and led to calls for officers to carry their own liability insurance. The impact of the 43-second video extended far beyond Dorothy and the courtroom. the life of Daniel Rodriguez was systematically dismantled. Following the indictment and the internal investigation, Rodriguez was fired from the police force. He lost his salary, his pension, and his health benefits. But the professional consequences were only the beginning. The notoriety of the video had made him a pariah in his own community. His wife, who had initially stood by him, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the settlement was announced. The strain of the legal bills, the public humiliation, and the revelation of his history of aggression destroyed their marriage. She moved out, taking their 2 children with her. The children faced severe harassment at school. Classmates had seen the video on social media and taunted them about their father being the crazy cop who attacked an old lady. The family was forced to leave the school district to escape the bullying. Rodriguez found himself alone, unemployed, and facing criminal charges. He was forced to sell his home to pay for his legal defense. He moved into a small rental apartment, a bitter irony considering how his troubles began. He could not find work in security or law enforcement. His name was blacklisted in every database. He eventually found work doing manual labor in a warehouse in a neighboring state, where he tried to keep a low profile. The police department also suffered collateral damage. The police chief was forced to resign 6 months later, bowing to pressure from the city council for failing to address the toxicity in his ranks. The department underwent a complete overhaul of its use of force policies. Mandatory training on de-escalation and interacting with the elderly was implemented for all officers. The officer in charge of the night shift who had failed to supervise Rodriguez was demoted. The morale at the precinct hit an all-time low, as good officers felt unfairly judged by the public because of the actions of one man. The ripple effects of that Tuesday night changed the lives of dozens of people, proving that unchecked authority eventually destroys everyone involved, not just the victim. In the final episode, we look at the long-term legacy of the incident. Dorothy eventually settled into her new home near her daughter. While the scars of the trauma remained, she began to heal. She adopted a rescue dog for companionship and security, and slowly began to trust her surroundings again. She declined most interview requests, preferring to return to the quiet life she had always cherished. However, her story continued to resonate. The Dorothy Law was proposed in the state legislature. This bill required that all police officers verbally identify themselves and state their purpose clearly before attempting to force entry, except in cases of active gunfire. It also mandated that any officer with 3 or more excessive force complaints be placed on desk duty pending a psychological evaluation. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rare occurrence in modern politics. The $50 doorbell camera that started it all became a symbol of modern accountability. Sales of home security cameras spiked in the region as citizens realized that their best defense against misconduct was an unblinking digital eye. Legal experts cited the case in law schools as a prime example of how video evidence has fundamentally changed criminal defense and civil rights litigation. Before the era of cheap cameras, it would have been Rodriguez's word against a confused elderly woman's word. He likely would have faced no consequences. The series concludes with a reflection on the power balance between the state and the individual. Dorothy's ordeal proved that justice is possible, but it often requires undeniable proof. The $865,000 settlement was a penalty paid by the system, but the real change came from the exposure of the truth. Officer Rodriguez's career ended not because he made a mistake, but because he refused to admit it and abused his power. Dorothy's quiet Tuesday night ended in violence, but her story ended in change. It serves as a permanent reminder that in the digital age, those in power are always being watched, and the truth is only a cloud upload away.